Hi everyone, my name is Brett Horvath and I'm with the Leaders Network. I am really excited for this panel. This is a really important topic going on right now, and it's a little difficult to get past the NPR, CNN narrative of what's going on, but I think it's hard to argue that what's going on in the Middle East isn't partially connected to the changes we've seen in social media and social networking. And it's a fascinating story, and in the past it's been easy to write off social media as this trivial thing. There's reports that 1% to 2% of all of Twitter's traffic is Justin Bieber related, and that my friends at Twitter tell me that there's actually a dedicated room instead of servers for Justin Bieber. But besides that, it's also an extremely powerful force for social change. Quickly, I'm going to introduce the panelists. We've got Richard Marshall, which was gracious enough to step on the panel. He's the head of Global Cybersecurity Management for Department of Homeland Security. We've got Anas here, who is a Syrian blogger and an editor at Global Voices. And then Jesse Driscoll, who is a professor of political science at University of California, San Diego, and has a background in research in Central Asia, state building, and anarchy, and has a forthcoming book about this topic. But a quick note of order. We didn't list Anas on the slide and aren't providing his last name just because we don't want there to be any kind of problem for Anas as he's covering these topics. He's from Syria and has been courageously covering what's been going on with protesters, both the killings and manipulations of social media by the Syrian intelligence services. So please meet this guy after the panel. He's a fascinating individual, but if you're tweeting about this or blogging, don't mention his last name because he's actually been accused of working with the CIA back home, which is absurd, but sitting next to Richard Marshall, we don't want to create any problem for him. So with that, I'm really going to just open it up. Like I said, we want to get past the CNN narrative that this is just about what's going on in the Arab Spring is just about young people with cell phones and Twitter accounts, and there's a more interesting intersection of intelligence services, IT companies, and activist groups. And Jesse, I'd love to hear more kind of how you think events are unfolding in the Middle East.
Well, so that's a big question.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the things to keep in mind as someone who sort of has the privilege of being a social scientist and gets to think about this stuff from 30,000 feet and a great distance is that there's obviously going to be a lot of journalists who write books in the next couple of years that you're going to be able to get at airport bookstores that say that this was all predictable, or that this is because of deep underlying grievances in the Middle East, or deep economic problems, or that this was something that was inevitable and inevitably going to happen. Nobody thought a year ago or 2 years ago that you would see the sort of contagion effects that we've seen across the Middle East. And one of the things that scholars who work on the breakup of the Soviet Union have noticed is that oftentimes you have events that are taking place in one part of the Soviet Union affecting other parts of the Soviet Union in a real tidal wave way, and that these events sort of take on a momentum of themselves that are, you can see in retrospect, and it's easy to do retrospective analysis of how things going on in one place has affected things in another. But that doesn't let you do predictive science very easily, not in a social science way. And so we can sort of connect the dots afterwards and say that we needed to have Tunisia before we could have Egypt, before we could have Syria. But that doesn't mean that you can, that anybody really knew this was going to happen. And it's obviously facilitated in some ways by social media. But I think that it's important to notice that it doesn't usually work in the ways that we expect or understand. Because if we could expect or understand, then the activists on the ground would have already reverse engineered that understanding in order to create mobilization overseas. Before it was an Arab Spring, Obama mentioned this in the speech. Before it was an Arab Spring, there was an attempt at a Persian Spring about a year ago. And what took that off the air was Neverland Ranch, right? You had these protesters in Iran who were Facebook friends with a bunch of activists in the United States. And you know that they were reaching out to Europe and reaching out to the United States because they actually wrote their placards in English for CNN. They weren't writing their placards in Persian. They were writing them in English and in French. And then, Michael Jackson died. and the news cycle just changed, and that really changed things for all those people in Iran. And I mean, I guess I really don't want to monopolize this. I'm much more interested in the conversation, but it's worth remembering that states evolved as social institutions. They didn't spring into existence at the end of the Cold War, and states are war machines. Ultimately, the states really get their authority from their ability to control violence within a set of territory. And there's a lot of, fluffy language that states use to legitimize that control of violence. But when the cameras aren't watching, bad stuff happens in a lot of these places. And the first adapters to this social media technology are probably student groups and activists and entrepreneurs. The second or third or fourth adapters, I'm sorry to say, are oftentimes security services who are capable of using the kind of analytic tools that marketers use to keep track of those activists. And that's something that you take for granted if you work in the former Soviet Union. You just sort of get used to having your email read by somebody, or or living with the possibility that your email is being read by somebody, and that changes how you do everything. And we take that for granted. We take for granted in the United States that we have certain kinds of freedoms and certain kinds of rights. But I don't know. I thought one of the really smart things that was said yesterday on the digital privacy panel was that you don't necessarily have a right to have it be private if you're breaking the law, right? If you have no, you should not have an expectation of privacy if you break the law. I don't remember exactly who said that, but that was really smart. The security services of Uzbekistan and Russia and China and Tajikistan and Syria, I imagine, would certainly echo that statement, right? The problem is that they define breaking the law in a much looser way than we define it here. And yeah, I
think that's a good point, that the first adopters may be these activists and younger people, but the second are intelligence services. And there's a very different story that unfolded in Egypt, where the intelligence services were mostly caught off guard by the power of social media. But in Syria, we have something different. So, Anas, tell us kind of what you have been covering and what you discovered.
Absolutely. The difference between Syria and Egypt is, in Egypt they were not that sophisticated when it comes to social media. There was no censorship, and on occasion they would harass some activists when they're traveling. They would confiscate laptops, but it was not a sophisticated process by any means. In Syria, they went from trying to censor a lot of websites to actually unlocking them as the protests started. They unlocked Facebook, they unlocked YouTube, among others. And they went from trying to just block out these platforms entirely to manipulating them, monitoring them, and actually trying to gather intelligence from them. In one case, regime loyalists started spam bots on FiRe to drown the conversation on the Syria hashtag. You would go to Syria hashtag trying to find info on the protest videos, just get info from people on the ground. And it was impossible because those spam accounts would have thousands of tweets a day, making it really hard for you to find information that's relevant. Luckily, people complained, some people wrote about it, and Twitter enforced their guidelines and removed the spam bots. In other cases, also they're also using Facebook now to spread propaganda, launch ad hominem attacks, and basically steer the public opinion in a direction that the regime wants. They also try to arrest certain activists, force them to give out their Facebook login information in an attempt to, data mine their network, their contacts, their past communications. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of security risks when you're an activist on Facebook, or even an average citizen. So that's a big issue as well.
Yeah, I think it's Nas is very humble, but he actually did a lot of the research identifying these Twitter bots that were every 2 minutes just putting out sports results from old soccer games or random Flickr images. And he covered this, and it got a lot of attention. And and Twitter eventually shut down those accounts. What surprised me, you told me, is that you didn't have a contact at the State Department or at Twitter. You just sent in a ticket to Twitter.com reporting this, and it was taken care of in a couple hours. Is that right?
I'm not sure of the time frame, but yeah, I just wrote about it, and from the support link, you send a ticket complaining about certain accounts, and they handle it really well. And what they did is actually they did not take them entirely offline, the accounts. They're still there, but they removed them from the search results. So they did not censor those accounts. There was no, violation of freedom of speech. They just stopped them from disrupting the conversation because, after all, these are lines of code that are sending out those tweets, not actual people trying to communicate.
Well, I think that's really interesting because with the track record of Twitter in Iran and the work the State Department did to keep Twitter server going while that process was happening shows the role that IT companies are playing increasingly in being brokers of information in these emerging markets. And that gets really tricky from a business standpoint and a foreign affairs standpoint of who you back. Richard, I'd love for you to kind of mention and talk about what are the hazards when you look at who are you going to back and how these companies or these institutions can be brokers.
Well, I think one of the most graphic examples of that is the ongoing situation in Libya. You have a cell phone system, a communication system that is owned by a foreign national entity that is not China but is in the Far East. Their loyalties thus far have been very close to maintaining status quo. They don't want to lose that capability. But then market forces come to play, which I think is just very fascinating. You have an individual who comes in, a Libyan national, made a massive fortune here in the United States, which is just yet another salute to the great American way of life. He takes masses of this fortune, moves over to Libya, and using the time-honored way of manipulating loyalty, aka bribes, he's able to patch in to the cell system that the Libyan government owns and is able to set up an independent cell system for those who are opposing the Libyan regime. I think that's just absolutely fascinating. The difficulty, though, that this illustrates is once you back a party, you're stuck with them. And so you have to be very careful as to who you decide to back. It can't be just out of emotion or some sense of tribal loyalty. You have to look at the unintended consequences that may occur downstream. Suppose your party is not around anymore, then you've lost. Suppose your group wins, well, you stand to benefit. But those are very careful considerations that are deliberative. And I think that's one of the reasons governments, State Department notwithstanding, in Iran, are so reluctant to try to pick a side. You want to back a winner, you never want to back a loser, whether it's horse races or politics.
Yeah, and while we've read a lot of, as Jesse would call them, airport books the last 3 years on the power of social media, we're seeing big companies, intelligence services, get really aggressive about it. And my personal experience, in 2007, I was advising a group of young activists in Egypt on using Facebook for flash mobs. And they had a couple small successes. And I was really excited saying, look, I'm doing some great things. I'm helping some young activists. And then a few weeks later, I didn't hear from them at all. And it took about a month. And I learned that they literally picked up in black vans at those flash mobs because Egyptian intelligence services had created false accounts. So even if there's not a savvy government, they're going to try and get in and use this. And then you get Syria that's going to the lengths of creating Twitter bots. So Anas, as someone who's trying to cover this and get the word out, I know his family in Syria, how does the element of that, the worry that intelligence services are listening and what they might do, affect your storytelling and your coverage?
I mean, in Syria, that's something you live with every day. It's just part of your day thinking. Everything you say or do in private or in public, you have the expectation of it being monitored. My approach with the current situation is that the more people who are aware of what's going on, the better. And the more people who knows about the crimes, the violations, the crackdown, the more easy it is to hold them accountable when the time comes. So, there's a lot of accusations, intimidation going on, but, I'm not unique. That they're going after anybody, talking about the protests in a favorable manner. They had people verbally abusing and attacking Twitter users, even who are not Syrian, but they just wanted to silence any conversation about this. And when it comes to Facebook, They also created what you call a man-in-the-middle attack, where they switched the Facebook security certificate in an attempt to, record users' login credentials and be able to spy on them without them even realizing. So they're trying to manipulate those platforms any way possible. Just allow people to use them, but we'll have everything under control and we'll manipulate it the way we want. It's really interesting to follow, and so far they've been really creative.
Well, I'm impressed with what you're doing, but it comes to mind that you really are a embedded, forward-deployed, informal journalist, because you're giving the world a first look at what is going on. So we're looking at life there through your lens. And then that begs the question of what inherent biases do you have, unlike news shows that, of course, don't have biases.
I would say I don't have, just for the record, I don't have any political affiliations. I just want people to have their civil rights, to have their freedoms, and to be able to have a really political discussion that just improves the democratic process in Syria. It's hard growing up under a Soviet-like security grip. And you feel it most when you leave the country, where, I'm using the internet and I'm not worried that somebody's actually looking over my shoulder in an internet cafe, or, spying on my internet connection, or nobody will pick me up at 11 p.m. for walking alone in the street. So it definitely makes a difference. And I just want, my bias is for people to be able to talk freely and in a civil manner.
Yeah, for me, it's really interesting taking everything we discussed yesterday in the privacy panel and all of the different lesser-known private companies that have access to this data and are selling it, distributing it, and what that looks like for people in countries with oppressive or at least partially repressive regimes is a really, really hard question. But even in the United States, there's some interesting examples. I don't know if people might have heard of the story of H.B. Gary, the security firm that sent a proposal to Bank of America to basically use online media and social media to destroy the reputation of Glenn Greenwald, who had been covering WikiLeaks and the Bank of America side of it, basically saying we're going to use social media to destroy his reputation and make him look terrible. So, Richard, what do you think about that from in terms of having a vibrant public debate and having journalists be able to be protected somewhat, knowing that there are private actors or people that will try and use social media to disrupt that?
Well, I'm all in favor of public debate, and I think in a discussion we had yesterday, I teasingly advocated, why do we even need to have secrets? And that was, the start of a philosophical discussion. I should tell you that I'm not completely without bias in terms of H.B. Gary, because they were very interested in some of my email accounts for reasons I just do not understand. But
is they being H.B. Gary or anonymous?
Huh? No, H.B. Gary. Because they were looking at certain information flow, and my email address came up somewhere, and a friend of mine notified me. He said, hey, I'm sorry, but they're looking at your email. Be careful. So I felt like I'd been in a time warp and moved to another country without my knowledge. I think it's dangerous when people, and of course they're going to do it, but it's inherently dangerous when people start using social media to manipulate reality. It's going to be very difficult to stop. It's going to occur, but it basically is just not a good thing to do.
Well, on that point, I've really enjoyed talking to you over the last couple of days and feel that I have more trust that the U.S. federal government is very intentional about maintaining that type of keeping that manipulation out of the public space. But there's also the example of the United States Air Force a couple months ago published on its website a request for proposal to create a system that would allow Air Force officials to manage multiple false online identities that could be used from the United States and then deployed in other countries. And so what does that mean for the trust of public space and conversation if we've got that kind of those kind of tools being discussed both in the public and private sector?
Well, I think it's a plus that it's being discussed in the private sector and the public sector.
We're discussing it right now, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, and if they really wanted to be sneaky about it, you wouldn't know it.
Totally. Yeah. No.
No, I mean, there's really something to that, right? Like, I mean, we have to remember that as this whole war on terror thing, goes on, in a never-ending way, and none of us can opt out of it, right? As voters and taxpayers, we're all implicated. We're fighting a networked enemy that is incredibly sophisticated, and our government has to, in order to keep all of us safe and provide the public goods that we all take for granted, like long lines at the TSA. We all buy into that, and we're fighting a networked enemy that's very sophisticated and very good at hiding from these intelligence services around the world. But we're also fighting a conspiracy theory, right? And it's very, very difficult to fight a conspiracy theory. As we learned in the Cold War, one of the things that really comes out over the long term when you're fighting a dedicated enemy that lies is that you have to be really, really careful to not lie back despite the temptation. And unfortunately, I think social media just makes it incredibly easy for everyone to lie. And the media market, the way that it's evolved in the United States, creates almost impossible incentives for different news networks to infotain with a 24-hour news cycle. And this isn't news to anyone who watches Jon Stewart. It's just, I think this is just maybe the world we live in. I think it's great that we can actually talk about this stuff because the alternatives are bad. As dark as all of that is, the alternatives are even worse.
Well, just to add on your conspiracy theory, how do you know that was true?
Well, it was on the Air Force's website.
That doesn't necessarily make it reality. I mean, it could all be a conspiracy.
Yeah, you can't prove a negative, right? I mean, this is why these things are so viral and so difficult to stamp out. People believe crazy things, and they really believe them. They really, really believe them. And I don't know what you do with that sometimes. I mean,
so
there's no there.
Yeah.
So that brings up an important question of the role that IT companies play in securing a public space for dialogue in democracy, both domestically and internationally. And Eli Paris here had the great TED Talk a month ago about these filter bubbles that we're in, and that he gave the example when you search Egypt, based on who you are and where you're coming from, you'll get a different result. I just wonder if any of you have thoughts about the role that IT companies will play in preserving that public space and how that intersects with social media and political change.
If you'll allow me, lots of the governments that get censorship software or monitoring for their infrastructure, they get it mostly from Western companies, from U.S. companies. And I think those companies have a moral responsibility to, not sell their software to authoritarian governments where that software will be abused. The software is mostly, developed for home, school, or business purposes, and not for an entire government to monitor and censor websites in a country. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. Facebook have a policy of not allowing pseudonyms, and that also endangers people who want to use the platform but not reveal their true identity. So there's definitely a lot of space where corporates and technological companies can play to assist in those matters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a good example that would illustrate your point is Google. Before they were attacked, they were cooperating with the Chinese in terms of filtering data at this end as well as at that end. And then later, when they became disengaged with the Chinese and the Chinese allegedly attacked them, they said, wait a minute, we're not going to stand for this anymore. And that just kind of points out the danger of making sure which side you back, from a political standpoint, but more importantly, which side do you back from a philosophical standpoint? If you're going to practice, or if you're going to preach freedom of information, then you need to practice it. and it needs to be fair across the board. It's disingenuous to argue for transparency, but then practice being closed. And I applaud Google for the stand that they're now taking, and that's an unpaid endorsement.
Very interesting. So the kind of the goal of this day is to look 5 years out and see what are the opportunities and the problems. And this is really a massively shifting space as we speak, and we're seeing a lot going on. But as the three of you look out the next 5 years, what are you worried about, or what are you excited about for the potential for social media and political change?
Well, let me kind of get things started, because I know you guys have some opinions, and I'm very interested to hear those as well. But one of the things that I advocate is that I think the internet service provider should take on a greater role of making sure to keep the pipes clean. And what I mean by that is, why should I have to accept the responsibility to make sure that the data that comes into my home from my internet service provider doesn't bring in malware? I think my internet service provider should do that. And in order to do that, they're going to have to do a deep dive of a lot of the information that flows across the lines, which raises the specter of, a great conspiracy and everybody's reading everybody's email. Right. But it's machine done. As my daughter is very quick to point out, Dad, there is no privacy on the internet. I use Gmail, and I know that when I talk with one of my friends about a shopping experience for shoes, my daughter says I quickly get ads for shoes that come in. So clearly somebody's reading my email. And I say, no one is reading your email. It's not a carbon unit that's doing that. It's a machine that's doing that, because it happens that quickly. And so one of the concerns when you have the internet service providers providing this safety net is, are they going to filter out just the bad, or are they going to pick political sides? And that's one of the dangers that you've experienced, and you've experienced when you lived in the Soviet Union and Russia.
I want to be clear.
One of the stands.
Yeah, I'm not sure I experienced it, but you kind of take for granted that a lot of people think they're experiencing it, because you never know, right? The only thing I really experienced that I know I experienced is that when there was a serious massacre that took place across the border. I was in Kyrgyzstan, and there was a massacre that took place across the border in Uzbekistan, a place called Onda John. I'm sure no one in this room has even heard of it. Clap if you've heard of the Onda John massacre. Yeah, right. So, something happened in Uzbekistan, and it was responded to very quickly by the Uzbek government, and it was responded to very quickly by the Kyrgyz government. The Kyrgyz government just turned off the internet. You noticed that you couldn't go on the New York Times website and you couldn't find out what was going on, because they didn't want the news to spread in a way that would be destabilizing. They didn't want populations moving across the border, it was one of the few times you really got to see the infrastructure. You got to see the off switch. You got to see what it looked like. And I ended up finding out about it through AIM. I pulled up my American Online account, and I had a friend in Seattle cut and pasting from the New York Times in the United States to. That's how I kept track. And this was one of those rare, we call them off the equilibrium path outcomes in economics, because it's one of those rare natural experiments that no one can predict, that lets you see how weak the state capacity is. They obviously weren't capable of micromanaging the information spread. They just turned it off. Yeah. And so that gave most of my friends a deep sense that these are high-capacity states that could be monitoring us at any time. It gave me a real sense that these are low-capacity states that have to hit the off switch because they're incapable of doing it on any time. But
So we've got about a minute left. I just want to hear from Anas. What are you thinking about the next 5 years?
My concern is that some other governments would follow the Chinese model, where censorship and online monitoring becomes an industry employing thousands of people and has its own homebrew technologies and software to do that. And what I look forward to is communications that can't be cut, that are decentralized. We've got people working on mesh networking through Android phones, etc. So it's definitely interesting to see how that would develop and how widely it's adopted.
Well, that's what makes what you're doing so critically important. And it also puts a burden on the reader, because we are now the Intel analysts rather than relying on some news service to help us form a decision. So we count on you to be accurate, my friend.
I do my best.
Indeed.
Great. Well, on that note, we're out of time, and thank you so much. It was a fun panel.
Yeah.
Thank you.